My name is Cheryl Lovato-Niles. I am the Water Resources Educator for WCU Extension in Whatcom County, and we are a proud partner to the Whatcom Watersheds Information Network, which we call WWIN for short. WWIN's mission is to help protect and restore our local waters and watersheds through information exchange, collaboration, education, and public engagement. And we are delighted to be hosting this speaker series event tonight. I invite you to sign up for our newsletter. You can do so from any page on our website, which you'll find at whatcomwin.org. And the newsletter comes out about once a month. It shares new research findings, water and natural resources related news, local events such as this one, and regional events. Training opportunities, including the free trainings that WWIN offers most years, as well as funding opportunities. We never try to sell you anything, we don't share your email addresses, and we don't solicit you for money. This tonight is our second event in the three-part climate adaptation series. The first focused on how Whatcom County Public Utility District Number 1 and the City of Bellingham are considering anticipated climate impacts to water supply. That event was recorded and it will be made available on our website soon. The third event will be focused on how the City of Bellingham's and tribal salmon restoration projects are factoring in climate change. And that's going to take place on June 12th, so please mark your calendars. Tonight's event is focused on how the City of Bellingham, the Port of Bellingham, and Whatcom County are planning for increasing flood risks, as well as current and future impacts to our shorelines. I personally always find it more pleasant to see people's faces when I present, so if you are comfortable leaving your camera on, that could be a nice thing to offer for our presenters. However, if you are eating your dinner right now and would like a little privacy, we would certainly understand that. There will be time for questions after each presentation, and you can ask your questions using the chat function. And there's no need to wait until the end of the presentation to enter your question. So if something comes up for you and you'd like to ask it during the presentation, go ahead and enter it into the chat. You can also ask your question by raising your hand. You can ask it verbally. And to do that, if you hover your mouse at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a raise hand icon. If you do that, then that flags us that you'd like to ask your question, and we can call on you so that you can unmute yourself and ask your question verbally. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Chris Elder. Chris Elder is the Senior Watershed Management Planner for Whatcom County Public Works. He serves on the WWIN Watershed staff team and has been supporting watershed, climate, agriculture, and forestry planning efforts for Whatcom County for the past 10 years. And Chris is here tonight to share information about vulnerability planning and shoreline management solutions. We'll turn it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. As Cheryl just said, my name is Chris Elder, Senior Planner with Watershed Management for Whatcom County Public Works. So I've been working on climate-related issues or planning efforts for Whatcom County for about 6 or 7 years since the initiation of the Climate Impact Advisory Committee back in 2017. I think as everyone is aware, we face a variety of flood issues, both riverine and coastal marine. So I'm going to try to do my best to describe where we're at in the planning framework, who we're working with, and kind of where we're heading overall. Let's see if I can get the screen to advance. Okay. So there's two efforts that I have served as the project manager for.
Sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Are you intending to be sharing your screen at this time?
Is it not coming through?
No, we don't see it.
Try it one more time.
Yep. Now we see it.
Okay. How about that? All right. So two planning efforts underway. So we generally refer to them as phase one and phase two. Phase one wrapped up back in June of last year, and that was referred to as the compound flood vulnerability. We have the benefit up here in the Puget Sound region of having the U.S. Geological Survey having completed what they refer to as the COSMOS model, the Coastal Storm Modeling System. So that kind of data collection effort was completed for the entire coastal shoreline of California. And then Puget Sound was the second part of the United States where they were able to actually implement that. So through using that Cosmos data, factoring in different sea level rise scenarios, we were able to actually model out vulnerability or assess vulnerability along the entire marine shoreline. And the reason it's referred to as the compound flood vulnerability is we were able to also intersect that with flood events off the Nooksack River. Right now, we're in the process of launching into phase two, which was titled Climate Vulnerability and Shoreline Management Solutions. So it's where we kind of take the outputs of phase one and try to move a little bit more into the action phase. And I'll go through some of this tonight. I just wanted to flag briefly, there's enormous amount of resources in Washington State, both the University of Washington Climate Impact Group and a lot of supporting agencies such as the U.S. Geological Survey have developed enormous amounts of guidance for local governments to try to tackle this and figure out, what is the best approach moving our efforts forward. Certainly, if there's anything I've learned in local government, a lot of how we do business is based on a static ecosystem, and climate change, and especially sea level rise, is kind of informing us that we don't live in a static environment. Things are dynamic and changing, and certainly appreciate having some of these guidance documents to push us forward. Just briefly, tackling greenhouse gas emission scenario, I think a lot of folks have probably dabbled in this, but you oftentimes see the RCP 8.5 and RCP 4.5. So that stands for Representative Concentration Pathways. Ultimately kind of means RCP 8.5 refers to the high emission scenario, so more carbon in the atmosphere. RCP 4.5 indicates that we've been able to reduce some of our emission pathways. So a lot of the different sea level rise projections have different tracks based on which emission scenario we're in. And I'll just say at this point, we are still very much in the high emission scenario. We kind of refer to that as the business as usual. So until dramatic efforts are made to reduce carbon emissions, we're still in that high emission scenario. This second bullet, level of risk or likelihood, just kind of indicates a lot of where these projections come from are based on computer models. So if it says it's a 1% likelihood, that means 1% of the computer models indicated that sea level rise scenario would occur by that projected time frame. In near term versus long term, we'll just kind of see over time these different scenarios kind of have different impacts in the short term versus the long term. So locally, again, we have the Washington Coastal Resilience Project, and the website link is down there where you can actually go and play around with different geographies along the coastal shoreline, different emissions pathways to kind of see where things are at. On this graph, I only have the high emission scenario showing, and I'll say that the low emission scenario, albeit the trend lines are a little bit lower, but they're all still very much heading in the upward direction. But this is just a good graphic, at least for my planning purposes. Those of you that are familiar with local government know that we're on the Growth Management Act kind of comprehensive planning time frame, which is 20 years. So if we figure we're in 2024 right now, so roughly 2044, looks like we're expecting somewhere between 1, maybe up to 2 feet of sea level rise. But if you look at the long game, out to 2100, kind of this middle line, that's the 50%. I guess this is the 50% likelihood. So there's a 50% chance that will be 2.5 feet by 2100, or there's the 1% chance, or actually, I guess this is the 0.1% chance that will be up as high as 8 feet by 2100. So just to try to set the framework of how big or how little it could be. For our phase one effort, we had to pick some different scenarios. A lot of this was based on what the Cosmos model provided us. So there's a lot of information on here, but ultimately, if you look at the sea level rise feet column, So we looked at 0.8 feet, about 1 foot, 3.3 feet, and 6.6 feet. And if you look at these timeframes here, there's a 1% chance that we'll hit 6.6 feet by that 2100 time frame, or there's a 10% chance that we'll hit that about 1 foot within the next decade or so. So this just kind of dictates the different scenarios we assessed when we were doing this vulnerability assessment. Just wanted to throw in one slide here just to kind of visually represent how we tried to intersect the coastal kind of sea level rise component with our projected future riverine flooding. So here you can see development, if we took Ferndale or some community that was near the river, as sea level rise comes up, that actually reduces the amount of riverine flow that can exit the mouth or the estuary of the river. This is one of the benefits we had of working with the U.S. Geological Survey, was to be able to actually have those two models interact. Vulnerability is kind of the defining component. As we have these different scenarios, how do we determine how vulnerable different communities are? And it's broken up into several buckets. Exposure, so this kind of represents, what is the amount of inundation that a community might feel, or the degree that that resource is likely to change. Sensitivity, how sensitive is that asset to that exposure? And just briefly, an asset could be a home, could be a road, could be a trail, could be an ecosystem. So that's kind of summarizes the potential impact, the exposure plus the sensitivity. And this adaptive capacity is how flexible or adaptable is that asset. If a road gets underwater temporarily, the water can go back, it'll be fine, versus if your home gets a foot or two of water, it's less adaptable. Not to mention you couldn't just pick up and move your home. All in all, that gives you your overall vulnerability score. And I just have one more kind of visual slide to kind of depict vulnerability at that level. So the more exposed you are, the higher the sensitivity, the higher your vulnerability goes up, and that kind of gets lowered down by your ability to adapt to that. So for our phase 1 project, we looked at 2 different communities, Birch Bay and Sandy Point. This is just a visual graphic for Sandy Point, where we identified structures, both public and private. This is largely looking at public assets as well as ecosystems. But here we can see that the fire station, which this is actually a picture of from, I believe, the 2022 storm event, where they got roughly 2 feet of water inside the fire station. Obviously has a high exposure component, highly sensitive for inundation. It has kind of a medium ability to adapt to that. So there's a pretty high vulnerability score. So part of the challenge with this assessment was to be able to take a lot of the data we were collecting and communicate it back to both policymakers and the general public. I just put this slide on here briefly just to kind of demonstrate the magnitude of difference between these different scenarios. So I have 2 red circles on the map. We have this 0.8 feet of sea level rise under a king tide scenario. So just with a little bit less than 1 foot, we can see that we have a little over 6,500 different parcels that are inundation, so private properties. Whereas if you look to the 6.6 feet of sea level rise under a 100-year storm event, that number more than doubles to a little over 12,000. Same thing with buildings. Under a 1 foot sea level rise scenario, about 500 buildings are impacted, and closer to 3,000 under that 6 foot scenario. I think the roadway was something kind of potent to me, which was looking at a little over 10 miles of both public and private roads to be impacted with 1 foot of sea level rise, as compared to a little over 77 with that 6 foot scenario. So where we've tried to kind of move this, now that we've done an initial vulnerability assessment, I'll be expanding that in this phase 2 effort, is starting to look at what are the different adaptation strategies available to us. I believe my next 2 presenters will probably go a little bit more detail on some of this, but I'm going to give kind of a high level overview. You've kind of got this accommodate, how do you kind of retrofit or better manage some of these flood impacts or higher waters that occur. How can you protect your infrastructure or your assets? And then kind of retreat being the option where you physically relocate whatever that asset is. And I think where a lot of us have kind of landed is that likely the outcomes or the recommendations are going to be a mixture or some hybrid mix of those different strategies. We have additional guidance from local planning efforts that you can look at for more details. And just rapidly, just put in a few kind of visual aids here to kind of help see. A lot of times people will have already built seawalls or kind of physical barriers to protect their infrastructure. They're kind of natural solutions where you can try to essentially ease off some of the impacts of storm and higher flow events, higher sea level events. You can accommodate where you actually elevate your structure to kind of get it out of harm's way. Certainly done a lot of that in the river floodplain. And then retreat was where you would physically relocate on a structure that could have been located here, move it out of the hazard zone. There's been kind of several questions around how do we do that? Do you limit additional development in the coastal zone? Can you transfer or move development rights to a different location? We can actually relocate some of those structures out of the hazard zone. This is just kind of a laundry list of different tools that we already have in our quiver, so to speak. We're in the middle of a comprehensive plan update. As a lot of folks know, there's this new requirement under House Bill 1181 to actually develop a climate element. A lot of local governments are trying to wrap our arms around what does that look like for Whatcom County and all the cities in the county. Similarly, Shoreline Master Program has the ability to be updated based on some of this new data. There's not currently state guidance on this, but locally we're trying to develop it and so on. And additionally, there are other implementation programs and policies that we can utilize to help communicate, explore, and try to solve some of this. So for this phase 2 effort, kind of where we're going from here is to try to expand the vulnerability assessment. I mentioned we only tackled Birch Bay and Sandy Point in phase 1. We're trying to complete the entire marine shoreline. We're also looking to go upstream to Deming, as well as the Everson overflow to Sumas, to look at some future riverine flood scenarios, looking to develop a pilot adaptation plan, pick one community along the coastline and try to help develop some recommendations for what are their best options given a selected sea level rise scenario, and also looking to develop adaptation strategies to apply across the coastal shoreline, and also looking at that adaptation strategies through our local planning documents. So we have zoning regulations, shoreline management program regulations, and our transportation improvement plan, which kind of directs public works spending and implementation. So that's the rapid fire summary of where we've come to date. I put a link on here. So Whatcom County webpage takes you to our climate change risks page, which is where that phase 1 vulnerability assessment lives. We also developed a story map. So a lot of the visual and narrative text that is contained within that phase 1 vulnerability assessment can be found there, as well as an interactive map. So if you want to look at different places along the marine shoreline and explore what different sea level rise scenarios look like, you have that ability. So thank you very much for having me, and happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. Are you able to drop those links into the chat by any chance?
I will.
That would be great. That'd be great. And while we give it a moment for folks to formulate their questions, if you have any, I do want to give special thanks to several of our WWIN team members who are on the call today. Rebecca Schlotterback with Public Utility District Number 1, Stephanie Salencian with the City of Bellingham, Austin Rose with Whatcom County, and Becky Peterson with Geneva Consulting. These are all folks who have been part of the speaker series planning team, and several of them are helping in the background to make sure that things go smoothly tonight. Do we have any questions either that folks want to put into the chat or to ask verbally? Thank you for dropping those links in there, Chris. All right. Well, there will be some time at the end as well. So if a question comes up for you, you can also ask it at the end. So next, I want to introduce Steve Sundin. Steve Sundin is the city's shoreline administrator and senior planner in the Planning and Community Development Department. He is going to talk with us today about planning for City of Bellingham's planning for sea level rise and coastal flooding. Thank you, Steve.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to have just a few minutes here. I don't have any visuals, so you'll just get to see my talking head here. But I did want to build on some of the stuff that Chris showed. There's a few things that I think are important for you to know moving forward. One is that we have been working in coordination with the county and their compound flood vulnerability work, and the port's been part of that process as well. So we've all been kind of connected at the hip in terms of what we're working on, nomenclature being the same, kind of approaching it in the same way. We're all working off the same baseline, which is the Cosmos model that Chris mentioned earlier. And so it's been super helpful to have a similar point of beginning as we go through this process. That's been really beneficial for us. I will say that the county is safely sort of out in front. They've been kind of leading the charge with their efforts, and we're lagging behind somewhat, but I will let you know where we are in our process. Simply put, we've been able to identify the assets that the city has that become inundated with a variety of coastal flooding scenarios, which, as Chris had mentioned, include a combination of sea level rise scenarios. And then we've also captured those same scenarios, and we've incorporated a 100-year flood event as well. And so we have some additional coastal flooding that comes in those scenarios. We have developed maps that show the flood depth above ground and the duration and the velocity at which water moves in those circumstances. We've captured all that imagery and all that information in those scenarios. And then what we're about to do is then to go back to our operations folks in the Parks and Public Works Department and go back and take them through training, if you will, and then begin that sensitivity analysis in terms of our assets and how sensitive, exposed and sensitive those assets are. And that will then lead us then to working on the adaptation plan. The adaptation plan is important because based upon the timing of the bigger planning efforts that are underway with most communities in Puget Sound, that being the comp plan and the SMP update, that adaptation planning effort will inform those two projects, which are also kind of running down a similar track. So we're moving forward in a variety of fronts, and just kind of just trying to, essentially limp the ball downfield and have these things addressed. And it's really helpful to have cohorts at the port and the county as part of this effort. We have numerous city staff too who are working on this from our side. I wanted to speak to that's kind of where we are now and where we're headed in the near term. I wanted to talk briefly about what we've been doing. Some people might not be aware that we have a waterfront district sub-area plan, and that basically is the area in our downtown waterfront from essentially the I&J waterway around to the very foot of the Cornwall Avenue landfill. It's a sub area. And in the sub area plan, it specifies that we are meant to incorporate sea level rise in our planning. Now, when we did that waterfront district sub area plan initially in 2013, the science was not as robust as it is now. And so we were working off a model that was a little bit more uniform, kind of one size fits all. And it was about 50 inches of sea level rise out to about the year 2100. And so that's capturing the sub-area plan, but where the rubber meets the road is in our what's called our planned action ordinance in SEPA, BMC 1630. And what we specify in there is that projects have to be designed such that they incorporate sea level rise in terms of like finished floor elevation of buildings and operability of certain facilities. And we've been applying the 50 inches. We've been applying the very top end of the range because since 2013, we've learned that that's probably a modest prediction looking out into the future. But I'd want people to know that when the development projects come in, and a number of projects that you might be familiar with on the waterfront have gone through this exercise. The All-American Marine Building went through this. The new buildings right at the head of of the I&J waterway where City Dogs are and the Books and Beer place. That those buildings there went through that analysis and have elevated to make sure they're above the Fisherman's Pavilion, the Harcourt condos, and then some of our other capital facilities, including Waypoint Park, and the cleanups that are also underway at R.G. Haley and Cornwall Avenue landfill. All those projects have included that 50-inch metric or analysis in developing those projects. So we have been utilizing that already, and we look to be more precise with that as the sub-area plan gets amended into the future. And then, of course, we would specify that type of analysis in the Shoreline Master Program update, which of course would cover all of the marine waters. We have a little bit different circumstance in the county. We have very few residences that would be impacted by sea level rise. But we do have significant facilities and properties, and Kurt's going to talk a little bit more about the ports analysis, but nonetheless, it's a little different situation in that we have a handful of large landowners that have assets in those areas. The other thing I want to mention is, and Kurt and others from the city, Kurt Baumgarten and others from the city, we did have a applicable, I'll just call it a case study, but an actual live permit that was applied for down at the Fairhaven Marine Industrial Park. That's down there at the mouth of Padden Creek on the east shoreline of Padden Lagoon. And there's a low spot on that property. It's about 9 feet or so, +9. And so during these coastal flooding events, that property experiences seasonal flooding, both from water coming down from Padden, but then also king tides and storm surges. And if they're combined, then they definitely have some issues. And so one of the things that we're just concluding with the Department of Ecology for permitting, essentially it was a flood control berm that was constructed around the outside of that marine industrial park along the shoreline of Padden Lagoon. And that was a very good on the ground sort of study and permit application for a project that at least as far as Bellingham goes, is really the first thing that has been proposed that addresses and attempts to mitigate this issue of coastal flooding and sea level rise. It was a very good effort. I don't really necessarily want to go into the details, but it was helpful in terms of looking forward and how we might be writing policies and regulations for these types of things that may be, we expect to be more common in the future, where people are trying to, or organizations, agencies are trying to protect their assets. And so right now, if this were one that was up on the wall, this would be a protect mechanism. And that was a very good exercise for us in terms of not only applying the rules we have, but thinking about how rules might be crafted and policies crafted in the future to address these types of projects. So those are the things I really wanted to convey. Again, Chris, thanks. You kind of laid down the groundwork, and you have a little bit more of a complete package to show and present. That's great. So I just wanted to put a finer detail on it with our local efforts here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. If folks want to go ahead and either raise their hand to ask questions or enter something into the chat now at this point, we have a couple minutes available where we can ask Steve some follow-up questions. Speaking of follow-up, I'll take this opportunity to mention that we will send a follow-up survey out to everyone via email, and we really appreciate getting your feedback. So look for that in your email inbox. And then also, see, there was some questions, a little bit of back and forth in the chat. Avery Maverick had asked if if phase 2 had been started, and Chris had answered yes, it was funded through a Department of Ecology grant, and that Whatcom County, is in the process of hiring a consultant to support the work. And the first kickoff meeting was a couple of weeks ago, and they hope to have phase 2 completed by June 2025. And then follow-up question, whether a detailed erosion analysis based on future sea levels is still being planned for phase 2 And Chris responded, yes, under phase 2, bluff erosion rates were extrapolated based on historic erosion rates. And phase 2 will update the projected bluff erosion rates based on different sea level scenarios. And then Felicia asked a question, what was the name of the House bill you mentioned? And Chris entered that into the chat. Okay, Alan has a question. Who will make the decisions with respect to relocating vulnerable infrastructure? Do you anticipate putting the risk of damage on private landowners rather than on the community as a whole? Is there a stomach for putting risk data on parcel deeds so the landowner understands the risks? Is the expectation that the governments will adapt to expected flooding rather than fighting it? By trying to control property construction through regulation, does the government assume the risk of damage and liability, any protective structures for damages to natural resources or other properties? Well, that was 3 or 4 questions.
Yeah, those are great questions. I will say from our perspective that those are things that we're going to have to address at the more and more we get into this. Right now, you know, like I said, and what Chris is working on at the county, we've identified what's likely to get wet, we'll just say, in these different events. And now we're doing what happens if they do, and what happens if they're wet for a certain period of time, or so, and so on. Then that baseline information then really helps us go into some of those things that you asked about, Alan, and we don't have answers for that at the moment, but we know that we are going to have to address those things. A lot of those questions will be answered through a public process that we have. You know, I think I can speak for the county as well, but the adaptation planning effort, where we really start making those hard decisions about how we, you know, whether we protect, retreat, accommodate, whatever word you want to use, that's a community decision. And, you know, typically those types of efforts are, you know, there's meetings, there's open houses, there's work sessions, and typically that's something that's adopted by the city council in the end. So it's a very community, open, transparent process, and we'll certainly go through that. And those questions will, you know, need to be answered as we go through that process. But for right now, it's tough to say one way or the other how those things are going to be approached. I feel like we're a little too early in the process.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in briefly to say that, you know, for Whatcom County's comprehensive planning update process, so we've flagged a direct connection with this vulnerability assessment. So we have 2 consultants working on updating the plan, one focused primarily on incorporating the climate element. So everyone's very much aware of this effort. And as I put in the chat, you know, our phase 2 project is scheduled to complete by June of 2025. So still kind of on track to be able to be incorporated into the comp plan. Doesn't get to the degree of resolution that you're asking about, Alan, but should inform some of the bigger picture conversations around potential changes to those land uses, what's allowed, and so forth. And the comp plan has a pretty robust public participation plan, and through our phase 2 vulnerability assessment project, we also have several public engagement opportunities as well.
Thank you. Lisa, also, Lisa Kaufman added that WDFW and the Shore Friendly program are investigating the feasibility of developing a low/no interest loan program that could potentially be utilized in the future for relocating homes and septics away, etc., away from the hazard zones on marine shorelines as a tool to help protect coastal processes, habitats, and species. Thank you, Lisa. All right. I think we'll go ahead and transition and welcome Kurt. Kurt Baumgarten is the Port of Bellingham environmental planner. Since starting with the port 6 years ago, he's been working on various aspects of climate change and resilience, as well as habitat restoration. Prior to the port, Kurt worked for the Washington Department of Ecology's Water Quality Program, Whatcom County Planning and Development Services, and the Skagit Conservation District. Kurt holds a BS and an MS from Western Washington University College of the Environment. Thank you, Kurt. And Kurt is going to speak to us tonight about sea level rise and coastal storm hazards adaptation.
Yeah, hi everybody, and good evening. And that part of that my talk will be focused on Port of Bellingham as the port's environmental planner. And I just wanted to throw out a couple things. Thanks to both Chris and Steve for laying out a lot of background and groundwork. Some of the things I'll go over you'll have heard a little bit about, and my goal tonight would be to see how an entity like the port is applying some of these tools. And for example, the model that's been mentioned a bunch of times to the USGS, that was a project. The coastal storm modeling system was a project that the city, the county, and the port teamed up on and tailored to Whatcom County. And so we've been working together on a lot of these issues for a long time. And I think one of the things that's come through so far is that we've been learning and understanding how things may roll out in the future. And we've started the conversation within our own organizations and between our organizations. And so I think it's important that folks realize, it's the beginning of a long and iterative process. And the last thing I'd like to say before I go into my slides is that this both the city and the county plan under Growth Management Act, and so there are comprehensive plans, and then there are also land use authorities. The port is not any of that. We don't set any code, and we don't plan under GMA. We are we are part of the City of Bellingham. We're part of the City of Blaine, and we're part of Whatcom County. So we are, as an agency, we're subject to the various regulations that are administered by those. And so I think that's some good background. And then I'm going to pick up my screen share here. Okay, are folks seeing a full screen of the presentation?
No, not yet. Oh, here it comes.
How about now?
Yep.
That works?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So what I'm going to do today is, let's see. There we go. So I'm going to go over some background, touch a little bit more on the trends in modeling that we've heard a bit about, and then show folks some of the current conditions that we're contemplating as we move forward with projects, and then and highlight some of the early adaptation measures, one of which being that project that Steve mentioned that we worked with on the city. And so I think it's important to frame for the port specifically. A lot of folks I've realized over the years don't really know that pretty much all of the port areas in both Bellingham and say Blaine, and then if you go elsewhere outside of our local area, most port areas on a lot of waterfronts are built on fill, and so very rough approximation of the shoreline pre-development is that red line you see on both of those photos. And so the elevations are pretty similar when you go down into that fill area. They vary within a few feet, 14, 16 feet lower, as Steve mentioned earlier, 9, 10. But generally, it's flat. And as sea level rise occurs, it's going to affect these areas, disproportionately than some other areas because the elevations are all very, very similar. And so it's, there's a lot of different aspects to it to consider, and I think something I'd also like to emphasize is how these filled areas, the infrastructure there ties back in upslope, and which can also lead to some of the limiting factors as far as what you're actually able to accomplish. And so one thing that hasn't come up yet is well, what is the sea level rise like historically? And what we're seeing is just under 5 inches of relative sea level rise in 100 years locally. And so when you go around the country, depending upon the geology and all, and whether the ground is still rebounding, say after last ice age, or if it's sinking due to some other factor, rates of change are very different. And in some places they're seeing, East Coast, they're seeing several feet. So relatively speaking, we have a bit more time than some other places that are dealing with more extreme effects right now. With that being said, though, there are still things happening around here that we are starting to address. And so some of this may be familiar to folks who live and experience this, but on several occasions down at Roeder Avenue and Squalicum Way, which is a major transportation route, not just for the port, but through the area, experiences enough flooding due to either king tide or combination of heavy rain events that the road can often be enclosed. And so that's one area of focus for the port. Marine Park has experienced some damage over the years, again due to storm surge, and so kind of brings it home that these are areas that need attention and will need to be monitored over the years as we get different storm events. Recent king tide in 2022, I think, illustrates some of the challenges coming up. Usually these walkways in that right picture that go down to a float are not horizontal, and so not a lot of space left there if the tide was up higher. And then the Squalicum boat launch shows water up and around light pole and really at the very edge of where the floats are. And so again, this is in 2022, and it shows some of the things that we need to be looking out ahead at. This is the area that Steve mentioned earlier along Paddon Lagoon, and it's in this particular picture on the left. It's very hard to discern the boatyard from the lagoon itself, but it's essentially it drops off at the edge of that fence. And in this particular event, water was up in and getting into some of the buildings there on site. And I'll get back and talk a little bit more about what we proposed as far as that berm Steve was mentioning and some other efforts. And this a lot of this work has happened, or some of this work has happened in conjunction with the city and the county and our efforts of trying to look ahead similarly. And so these are you can call them planning products or tools that we have to work off of. And so there's the relative sea level rise model that the University of Washington developed, which I like to refer to it as more of a static model, in that it's some folks call it like a bathtub model. It gives you just as time goes on, here's what you could project seeing. Whereas the coastal storm modeling system, the Cosmos model, is more of a dynamic model, and it adds atmospheric conditions and storm surge on top. So it's sort of like where the real action occurs, because we all know that it isn't all just about sunny day, high tide flooding. It's oftentimes if tide's high and you have a storm event, that's where you start to see more of the actual energy affecting infrastructure and causing erosion and damage. And then in 2023, we port put together and adopted, commission adopted a climate action strategy, which addresses both the mitigating efforts of reducing climate emissions, as well as adaptation measures. And so I'm just focused on that tonight. But we have a whole other program that looks at reducing port greenhouse gas emissions and carbon pollution. And then with that climate action strategy, we developed a master list of climate resilience actions that we could continually refer back to kind of frame our budget priorities and look for opportunities for grants and have this kind of already thought out and supported in some planning documents. And so similarly to the city and more specific to what the county has been doing, we did work with a consultant on a port-wide vulnerability assessment. It's a very high level view of when you combine these other tools, the Cosmos modeling and the UW modeling, what is it that, what does it look like around the port over a variety of different scenarios, and what could you expect, and kind of helps focus efforts for planning. And then more specifically for a couple areas, we dove in a little deeper on a exposure sensitivity and adaptive capacity analysis. And so with that, this is just same slide you saw earlier. And I think just a couple things I'd like to mention here. When you look at the lower end of the graph down in the coming years, you see more agreement between the lines, and then it starts to diverge. And so I think that just speaks to, more confidence early on in the modeling, and later that you see a little more divergence in what could possibly happen. So I think what that does is it gives us a good bracket as to where we look, and then you think about an asset and you think about its longevity and you think about its value and its adaptability, and then you can kind of think about a planning horizon for that particular asset. So I've been asked often, well, what exactly are your planning scenarios, for port work? And we're working through that right now and using some examples and trying to develop maybe some guardrails for that based on some real examples, but there won't be any one particular that I see at this point. There won't be any one particular, like, this is the sea level rise we're planning for. It's going to be kind of asset based, and also what opportunities there are project by project. So with the Cosmos model, we took it one step further and actually created a web-based, we had a web-based viewer created so that we can run a variety of different scenarios. And so this is just a snapshot of just some of them. And so for example, for a 1/4 meter, we can look at flood extent, flood depth, duration, current velocity, and height. This particular image is showing a 1/2 meter of sea level rise over in the well, our maintenance shop area is here, and this is the shipping terminal. And this is with a 100-year storm event on top of that 1/2 meter sea level rise. And so on a planning level, it helps us identify, where the low spots are, where would we do more effort when we're proposing or contemplating a project in that area. And so taking that the next step, our consultant used the Cosmos model and pulled together our coastal vulnerability assessment, which kind of collated some of that other modeling, and just put it specifically on the port rather than county-wide. And so we came up with a bunch of different scenarios here, and this is basically showing again that 100-year storm event with the 1/4 meter, 1/2 meter, and 1 meter sea level rise, and and that's represented by those different shading colors there, and you can see obviously how things expand more. And one caveat with this is that it's the imagery behind it becomes static once the modeling outputs were developed. until it's updated again. And so there may be changes beneath these layers that you wouldn't now see, where grades have been elevated. And so it might not look just like this anymore for any particular given scenario. And then we also did a vulnerability assessment, looking at the actual risk. And so we put a color coding on the higher risk areas. And again, it's just a different way of looking at the information and approaching it more, with an eye towards the risk versus just the area covered, or the extent of coverage for flooding. And so getting into that, exposure sensitivity, adaptive capacity analysis, we did that specifically for our maintenance shop area, as it was identified in the vulnerability assessment among a few other sites as more likely to experience effects sooner than later. And so and we use that as a template so that we can do other, we call them ESAs, other ESAs as we move around and have funds available. We can look at other specific areas as needed. And so with this template, it kicked out a matrix of various assets within this planning area, this maintenance shop area for the port. And so as we look ahead towards various capital projects, we can refer back to this. And I've been working with our engineering and project management staff to make sure they're aware of these tools. And so we're having evolving conversations about how to best incorporate this type of information that we have now for a lot of areas. And so when it comes to, well, what is the port doing for adaptation? I grabbed a couple different projects, one that's been completed recently, one that's, as you heard about earlier, is moving through permitting, and then one that's more envisioned in the future, just to kind of give a flavor of how we're approaching things. So a couple of years ago, the port received a grant from the Department of Ecology to enhance the shoreline down at Little Squalicum Beach. And one main goal for that project was to incorporate as much resilience, long-term resilience, into it. And so the site itself, in choosing a design, because of the 10-to-1 slope, created basically the maximum beach size you could fit into that area. And then we elevated it along the back. It's hard to see in this picture, but if you've been down there, you kind of have to come up out of the parking lot to go down. And so it's elevated about 2 to 3 feet above the surrounding grade, which should set us up for no inundation, even for a 100-year storm event at just shy of 2 feet of sea level rise. The Fairhaven Marine Industrial Park, or FMIP, is proposed to raise the grade in the area that floods in that picture, and then install a berm that would be up to about a little just shy of 13 feet, which would be projected to be just 4.5 to 5 feet higher than the medium high water. And that berm and site grade could be further adapted later. And then we're also looking at groundwater effects, because with rising tides also comes rising groundwater, depending upon the nature of the fill. And so looking at some of the infrastructure to make sure it resists some of those pressures from the increased groundwater. And then looking at this one out a bit for 44 inches of sea level rise, which would give about 12 inches of freeboard at the higher end of a design life. So again, we go back to, well, how long are we projecting this to last? And so we had looked into doing more work on this site, but we ran into some site constraints when it came to various elevations, and then also just costs of trying to raise buildings. And so this is a first step at adaptation on a challenging site. And the last bullet alludes to that, where it's without substantially reducing the usable area or having to get into a major site rebuild is the first approach here that can be adapted later more. And then we're in the planning stages for Inner Squalicum Harbor upgrades, and some of the things that can happen here are, taller adaptable pilings, raising the landings areas for the ramps, since some of them actually go down a little bit of a depression before you head down the ramp. Looking at stronger hardware, and many of these improvements will also serve to benefit against if there was a tsunami that would come in and affect the infrastructure. So that's just quick run through of some of the stuff and how that we're looking at for adaptation, and how the port is approaching things at this point. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Kurt. There are a few questions, and I do also want to acknowledge that it's 6:28. Steve and Chris, are you able to stay on the call for a few minutes past 6:30 in case there's some additional follow-up questions for you as well? Is that a possibility? Chris, I see a thumbs up.
I have a few minutes, yes.
Okay, great. So I'll go through some of these questions quickly, and then we'll see if there's any final wrap-up question. So thank you again, Kurt, so much. Alan had a question. Said models provide some insight. The risk needs to be assumed by those who are in areas at risk, whatever the future may bring. It is expected that those who evaluated the risk and acted accordingly will have to subsidize. Is it expected that those who evaluated the risk and acted accordingly will have to subsidize those who did not properly evaluate the risk? This applies to sea level rise as well as changes in the nature of precipitation. Sounds like this.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Is that a question? I'm not sure how the port would answer that question. It seems more broader. Since what I was referring to is really, things that are more within port operational control. So I'm not sure, as far as assuming responsibility, how to answer that.
Steve or Chris, do you have a response?
This is just kind of flagging. Alan's always got good questions. This is where a lot of our future conversations are going to go. But even based on the November 21 floods that hit the riverine ecosystems, there was a knowledge of development in the floodplain. Certainly those property owners experienced the impacts, and both financial and real world, and the county and FEMA are providing some relief, not all the relief. So I think as we look at bigger geographies, coastal areas, we're going to have to crack this question back open. And I know, nationally there's concern around whether or not FEMA is going to be able to keep pace with the magnitude of impact around the country. So it's a huge question, definitely one that we're aware of. Don't have a clear answer for you at this point, though.
Thank you. Thank you. Felicia has kudos and appreciation, Kurt, for hearing about the wonderful work that the port is doing. She writes, I'm curious about your experience starting these difficult conversations within and between organizations. And do you have advice for other jurisdictions who are wanting to engage in these types of holistic planning approaches, but are not as far along yet in those kinds of conversations?
Yeah, that's a good question. We've been really fortunate here. We were, between the three jurisdictions, we were able to partner early on that USGS project, which I think really kind of set the stage for us to have some unique insight for our community, compared to, since I think we're the first county in the state to do that. So that really kind of helped start some of the conversations. Then, of course, with growth management, now the city and the county are involved in, that with so coming down from the state, that's pushed the needle on those conversations as well. And then, within the port, we basically started right away, or I started right away with my colleagues, kind of rolling out the information as we had it. And, and it's taken a bit to get to the point where some of the project managers are now like, oh, right, we have these tools. How should we bring them in early on a project? And that's coming along really well right now. I'm really happy with the response I'm getting from staff, and that, it's projects are complicated with all the permitting and everything, and there's just one more thing to contemplate. But I think there's good buy-in that it's an important thing, and so I guess I would have patience. That would be my advice. Would be to have patience and get your tools in order, see what's out there. Like Chris alluded to, there's lots of things in Washington State that can help point you in the right direction, and then see what you can do to get community-specific information, if at all possible.
Thank you. Mark Fairhart wrote, has a comment more than a question, citing the city of Seattle's experience after excessive rainfall events. He wrote, the city prohibited development on steep slopes, and over time developers and landowners provided engineered plans that the city accepted and then allowed development on those slopes. And then when rain events subsequently caused landslides and property damage, the landowners sued the city because they'd issued the construction permits. So he's providing that as a cautionary tale.
I would just jump in real quick on that point, and that is that the Island County and some of those other communities that have, we can all envision those beach houses that have been in families for years, and they're built on the sand or on pilings, and they're relatively, low in relationship to what a high tide does currently. And one of the things that is currently happening, and both property owners, individual property owners, and agencies are wrestling with is, let's say I have a beach house, and I have the resources to be able to build protection around my beach house, but the people down shore in either direction don't necessarily have that. And then that, can exacerbate impacts onto others as well. So there's this whole thing that's already happening where people are trying to protect, and they're kind of, in some cases, they're out on their own, and it could be at the expense of others that are next door or nearby. And it's tough to, imagine that every single private property owner that has I'm just saying, a beach cabin in that circumstance is going to be able to have the resources to join in and do it. So we're already not fighting, but we're already seeing kind of the piecemeal approach to this. And so what we're trying to do here is to provide this, baseline of planning information so that decisions aren't made, just, hey, I got to protect my stuff and my stuff only. We're trying to coordinate here so that our planning decisions are consistent with each other. And I guess that's the thing about coordination, is the sooner you can coordinate with others, whoever those others are, the more success you're likely to have.
Thank you. Alan has a question that hopefully is easy to answer. Will berms in Paddon Estuary increase the flooding risk in Lower Paddon Creek?
That is a great question. Kurt, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take that?
No, I think you have more familiarity with how the FEMA process went for that, but it had to be analyzed, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And so the port submitted a couple different analyses that that basically demonstrated that with that coastal flooding combined with the 100-year storm event, that there wouldn't be backup into the estuary. There, I think the bigger concern is that the actual mouth of the creek, where it travels underneath Harris Avenue, is somewhat constrained. And I believe that the city has begun taking some preliminary look at the way that water passes underneath Harris, which is somewhat constricted, especially in those bigger events. But the analysis that was provided as part of the application for the project itself didn't demonstrate or show that there was going to be any upstream impact, if you will, from that flood control berm.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I'll go ahead and just provide this final question so that we can, we're a little over time. Alexander Harris wrote, "Thanks so much for the presentations. Can any of you comment on what strategies have been effective at helping non-technical folks, elected officials, general public, etc., understand the magnitude of these impacts and what communication techniques have worked for you?" So I think that's for all of you.
We've sort of been working in the background up until this point. We have presented to council a couple times with just sort of where we're at, and we have included some information about the Cosmos model and provided some preliminary findings on flooding extents. I maybe Chris or Kurt has it on the top of their head, but I believe that there are several agencies, whether it's Washington Sea Grant or UW or a combination of the two, do have some map viewing tools where you can plug in your favorite coastal flooding scenario and then understand kind of how areas are affected. But I can't pinpoint exactly what's available currently through a more public forum.
I mean, I'll just say briefly, the person in the chat said, visuals, maps and photos are key. That visualization tool, the county definitely has it. It's included in that compound flood story map that I provided. And it's kind of why I tried to put a lot of graphics in my presentation. And I think for a lot of us to wrap our heads around what the implications are of sea level rise, we kind of need to see, what does that look like? Or, some of the photos we've got, I try to always include several photos of king tide and high storm events just to start hopefully connecting the dots of, these impacts are real and it's not just a theoretical planning exercise. So that's a strategy I use, Alex, just to try to make sure we both provide the narrative as well as kind of the visual aids.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Whatever tools you have at your disposal, and the fact that we do have that, modeling is very helpful because you can graphically represent some different scenarios. I know for our port commission, since I've been with the port, they've been supportive of the efforts we've been, kind of rolling out for our climate change efforts, and that it was, basically it was a long process and it involved lots of updates and check-ins, right? So we didn't just put something together in a silo and then present it. There was working with key staff to make sure there were no surprises essentially. And so I think that's a good way to bring along the non-technical folks, as you indicated. And it's just a bit of a process to get everybody up to speed so that you can get good support. And I think that's really key for this type of effort.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to call it here. We're at 6:40. I really appreciate you all being so generous with your time and your expertise and helping us understand how the county and the City of Bellingham and the Port of Bellingham are anticipating these impacts due to climate change and are planning, how to deal with those. There are a few additional links and comments in the chat. Among them, gratitude for these great presentations. And so I would encourage folks to read through those quickly as we close out this meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate it for sure.
Thanks.
All right. Have a lovely evening, everyone.